The African-American legend Sea Rice highlights the accomplishments of blacks in areas as varied as politics, sports, aviation, business, literature, and religion. We will explore how African Americans have succeeded in areas where they had been previously excluded because of segregation, racism, and lack of opportunity. I'm your host, Dr. Roscoe C. Brown, Jr., and with us today is Reverend James Forbes, Pastor Emeritus of the Great Riverside Church. Glad to have you with us today, Reverend Forbes.
And good to be with you, Dr. Brown.
All right, but we've worked on a lot of things together, and in 2010, there are so many issues in our society that have moral and spiritual implications. What do you think are the most important of those issues that have moral and spiritual implications today?
I have been thinking about that because as my work with Healing of the Nations Foundation requires me to think about what are the national issues that we ought to be addressing. Mm-hmm. The most significant issue today in America, as I see it, is what I call the G factor. Now, what is the G factor? Mm-hmm. The G factor is greed. That is to say, more decisions, policies, and even the paralysis when it takes place, just follow the money. In a sense, there is in the Bible this phrase, you cannot serve God and mammon. Within our society, guess who's winning? Money. The dollar bill has on it, in God we trust, but really, it is not God in whom we trust. It is our material resources, our money, and the power and influence which comes as a result of that money. So I have looked at the fact that the major problem right now is that we human beings have material needs, of course, but we are spiritual beings. We are beings who have to think about meaning and purpose and community and the common good. Anytime your energy, your investment, and your reliance upon one aspect to the exclusion of the other, relying on the material rather than the spiritual, you are out of balance. Our nation is significantly out of balance. And the best example of that right now is that they are debating in Washington whether there should be health care for all God's children. Mm-hmm. And the people who are making the decisions all have wonderful health care plans. But they are debating whether the rest of God's children can get that. I think, therefore, greed is it. The Supreme Court decision allowing corporations to invest money in regards to elections, that's another sign. Follow the money. Greed. The foreclosures on homes, the national malaise around even immigration. Every issue I've looked at, that G factor has been figuring into the malaise.
Now, the question that I was thinking about as you were talking is there are some things that tend to take that greed factor, put it aside, and deal with the spiritual. The classic example is how a city or town can get excited about its football team or its basketball team when they're winning. Everybody is talking to each other, wishing the team well. True enough, sports is about money, but they are really interested in how my team, I'm from Chicago, I'm from Philadelphia, how they feel. The question I was wondering is how can we translate that type of spirituality, that type of involvement into the national body politic? How can we get that moving? Because true, people need to eat, live, have health care, but the way they get it relates to money. And then how do you build a sense of community that deals with the money, but deals as much or more with the spiritual aspects, the need aspects, the respect aspects?
Well, we've just celebrated Dr. King last month. Dr. King said that what God was looking for was to build the beloved community. Mm-hmm. And I know that every individual derives strength by finding something to identify with.
That sports thing.
That's that sports thing you speak about. Well, suppose we could get people to believe that the most significant affiliation was the human race and the beloved community within the human race, such that people will say, well, the issue in Haiti came up, because we know there's solidarity and that we are in the inescapable web of mutuality, we diverted much of our money, resources to build up that, because we are a part of the human race. We are a part of the beloved community. It is finding the image. Am I black? Am I white? Am I rich? Am I poor? Am I gay? Am I straight? Am I liberal? Am I conservative? Suppose a more significant question was, am I an honorable person? Of course, that we preachers struggle with this. It is very difficult to get people to take a kind of spiritual high road when the concreteness of you rah, rah, rah for the team, or when the benefits which comes from one's race, or the benefits which comes from one's family tradition. So it's hard to get them to buy into it. I mean, I wish I'd have a football team, pardon me, called Human Race Fighters, or Human Race Champions, and have T-shirts. Human race.
Well, some of the conservative Christians do just that.
Yes, they do.
But and that raises the question: what is humanity? What some people's humanity is one thing. What other people's humanity is another thing. For example, in Haiti, they were talking about how you're going to take care of the orphan children, and all of a sudden, some people go in there and take their children from the Haitian families, and the argument, you know this a long time, is it better to have children in intact families, or better in adopted families that have more resources? How do you work through those complexities? Because if this thing we were talking about was so simple, it would have been solved 5,000 years ago.
A human being. I think one of the ways to get at that is, who am I? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I think I am a biological creature. I'm a part of the animal kingdom. I have the necessities that the dogs, the cats, and the cows have. But to be a human being is also to have consciousness of who I am, and also consciousness that I live today, but I may die tomorrow. Mm-hmm. I have consciousness that I did not give birth to myself, that I am a part of a community that nourished me into being. So a human being is an animal of an extraordinary, rich heritage, because we also have a soul, we also have a spirit, and we also have a consciousness.
Well, does that spirit have a direction?
I think the way I look at it, the direction is based on body and spirit. I am an evolutionist. Mm-hmm. I believe that biological and spiritual processes are moving. However, I believe we each will have input into which way it's moving.
But the environment determines the nature of that input.
Well, I would say environment is the context in which it is worked out. Mm-hmm. And within the environment, we have givens. But to be a human being, there is always the capacity to have input into the outcome of your existence.
Let me ask this. Is self-satisfaction, greed, a part of the human psyche?
Well, see, here's the problem. You've just mentioned satisfaction and greed. Mm-hmm. You can't put those together mm-hmm. as if they are synonymous, because mm-hmm. there are people who got all the money in the world and they still are not satisfied. Right. So from my perspective, one is satisfied when one has the sense that I am fulfilling my destiny. Mm-hmm. I know who I am, mm-hmm. I'm proud of who I am, mm-hmm. and I've chosen work in the world, mm-hmm. or I've chosen a cause to work for. But I am myself, and I feel unrestrained in regards to pursuing my life's objectives, and I'm making a contribution to others, and I'm deriving satisfaction out of the achievement from my vocation or my artistry or my charity. There is where the satisfaction is. We have been duped into believing that your satisfaction comes from how much money you got, mm-hmm. because it gives you the wherewithal to purchase the mm-hmm. things that will satisfy. But some of the most important things in the world you can't buy, like friendship, like love, loyalty. Like a sense of loyalty, that kind of thing.
Now, but how do you sell that to people? Because there's so many things that sell the material and the prestige. How do you sell that to people? You've done a great job of it your whole life because that's what you do. But how do you do it? What are the principles behind that?
You know, in my job as a salesman of high ideals, I discover that often I can make my best sell when somebody has found the futility in the things they've been running after, or in the moments of vulnerability when people have to stop and ask, well, what is the meaning of my life? Especially when it grinds down to a halt or when they find serious obstructions. Isn't it interesting that they say love finds its way through the broken parts? So that's the first thing. A lot of times it's basically a matter of my experiencing limits on my life that people begin to ask, is there a framework that gives me what I call comprehensive coverage? Comprehensive coverage is it takes care of my body, but it takes care of my spirit and my soul as well. Secondly, sometimes, occasionally, people are so blessed that they start to think, I've received these blessings from somewhere, so that I think there is a philanthropic impulse in everybody. A person who experiences abundance can either decide to hoard it or to see how they can give back some or how they can enrich the community of which they are a part. So sometimes it's not just because folks have run into a hard luck, but sometimes when they've been blessed, they want to know, what can I do to say thanks for the blessings I have received? That's another time when I can sell high ideals.
Well, in our society, we work through institutions. One of the institutions is religion, another is government and politics, another is the way in which we deal with our arts and our culture. You're in the religious business. Some of us work across in the political business, trying to change the way in which people respond to issues. What would you say is the way of bringing more humanity into politics?
I think the way to bring more humanity into politics is to limit the impact of money
Number one, I agree with that.
Determining who the elected politicians are going to be. So that's the first.
Okay, I agree with that.
If you could make it so that a true democracy exists, where the people select their leaders and their leaders are sensitive to the aspirations and hopes and needs of their people. That's real down the road already.
But remember, true democracy is the majority rule, so you have 51-49. That's the issue that we have.
Yes. It does not matter to me, except I'd like to think.
Right.
Yesterday I was in somebody's office, and there was a book on the shelf. It was written by Norman Cousins, and the book was entitled The Pathology of Power.
I remember that.
It's practically impossible to have lots of money without assuming that that means you should have much more say in terms of the direction that things ought to go in. And it is difficult to have that money without using your influence to buy up the centers of legislative and executive and even judiciary influence. So I gave it as the first. It's almost the first and the second. Let's figure out how to be that democratic society where people make choices and that they are informed choices, which gets us to the next one. If we could make sure, and we are using media now, thank God for media, if we could make sure that the influence back of media was not yet the profit that can come from the enterprise, but also a commitment to the truth of the culture and through the positive values of the culture. If media is controlled by money, big money, in the hands of a few, that becomes another way in which democracy is frustrated, because the power of the media to describe what is and to suggest no almost with propagandistic influence to insist on what ought to be, there's a second assault against true democratic ideals and true humanity. That's another. The other one is that churches that have politicians in them ought to stop preaching at politicians and hold more seminars to talk with business leaders and politicians about, here are the values we preach from our sacred writings. How do these values impact the way you carry on your business, or how does it impact how you fulfill your political responsibility? We shout too much at people. It's really one of the real things I want to push for, and that's what I do in my book, Whose Gospel?
Yes, we want.
Is let's come and reason together. I'm a progressive, but it doesn't help me to shout at conservatives. What I've tried to do in my book is to describe why I believe what I believe about sex, about race, about class, and about gender, about war, and about the environment. When people share how they've come to where they are in terms of their ideas, you can have much more, I think, civil conversation. When people only look at what's your position on this and they start attacking your position with their position, that is not as fruitful. So in my book, I'm encouraging people, if you're liberal, let's talk to conservatives. If you're conservative, let's talk with the liberals. And I know that's not easy, but we got to try to do it.
Let's take a present day example. President Obama was elected on a wave of hope. He preached the audacity of hope. He preached we can do it together.
Changes
it. And he tried to talk with the people who, on the other side, the conservative side. Somehow or another, that conversation broke down because they said he was trying to be a socialist. He was trying to put too much government into people's lives. So these issues that we're talking about are very nice in generalities, but when we begin to dig down into them, as they say, the devil is in the details. Now, in your book, Whose Gospel, you talk about relationships between various denominations, relationships within denominations. How do you suggest we get past that fact that once we get past the superficial or the surface and we dig deeper, those conflicts emerge and some of those basic beliefs tend to be somewhat intransigent?
Well, first of all, let me say for Obama, he has taught us one lesson, and that is, if you say you are committed to bipartisan leadership, be committed to it for the long haul. Do not allow it to stymie your advancing of your program, because if you don't get anything done, you're in real trouble. But notice, that conversation that he had last week with the Republicans is an example of a guy who really must have meant it, because he went there to talk with them, to hear their questions, and to give them response.
That was his meeting with the
Republican leadership
at the Capitol.
That's
right.
correct. That's correct. I like that. Now, what I know is it is one of the most difficult things in the world to have conversation with people who don't hold your ideology or don't hold your perspective. That's why you try to write a convincing book that they'll have to read.
Okay.
So my book might have been called simply something like Think on These Things, the 5 or 6 most serious issues dividing the nation. But it's called Whose Gospel? And that's partly, I think, to say that there are conservatives who believe in the gospel. But I'm trying to say there are many different gospels. Let me share with you what good news there is in my perspective, and maybe it will evoke exchange with them about the good news they see in their perspective. So I think the way we have to go about this thing is, don't expect it. Like if you have a conflict in your house with your spouse, don't assume that the first time you have the argument, you're going to get it straightened out. 5 years later, if you hang in there, maybe they will say, oh, so that's what we've been fussing about all these years. You got to be really seriously dedicated to it, and not to pursue your life as if winning consent to your ideas is the only way you can move forward. You got to move forward even if everybody disagrees with you. But one of your goals will be that we can come to some unity of understanding, enough at least to face the threats that
See, in our society, meaningful change comes about mainly through legislation. And one of the issues in the healthcare legislation is there's so many compromises that have been made that practically nobody likes the legislation. How do you get around this idea of making a compromise work for everybody?
When you're trying to do, for example, let's take Mr. Obama. I would wish that we who are the public, who really love the public option, who really even thought maybe even single payer was good, or who thought that maybe Medicare should be expanded, or who thought that maybe there should be some way in which there can be a cap placed on how much can be charged for the medical resources we get. I wish we had done a better job in the streets. Notice, I'm not a street person. I'm not a marching guy. I'm not a protest parade guy primarily now. But I told somebody, Roscoe, Dr. Brown. Roscoe, listen, I told somebody, maybe if enough of us would have gotten on Fifth Avenue, 12 noon, with all of our clothes off, and when the police rounds us up, and ask us, what's wrong with you guys? They say, we're trying to make a point. Well, what is the point? Everybody needs coverage. I told them, now that's, people say, Jim, keep your clothes on. I think that's important. But what might have made a difference would have been a more vigorous manifestation of progressive insistence that this matters to us. I hear people always talking, the American people want this. I also know that the polls are appealed to. Well, which poll was it? Because polls have partisan dynamics as well. I wish that people who are progressive would figure out what level of public witness is necessary to push a good leader in the right direction. Because you and I know that if you are in politics, it is about horse trading. It is about trying to find where you can get consensus. I am a little bit disappointed that the president's what I call, he's a principled pragmatic. He always wants to figure it out, and he's an academic too, and all of that and that. But I don't want to blame him. I'm trying right now to do what I heard that they did for Roosevelt. People would go in to talk to Roosevelt about some New Deal thing, and he says, I agree with you. Now go out and make me do it.
Yeah, that's what he did.
The point is, for those of us who have progressive understandings of what's good for this nation, we have to go out and make President Obama do it. By say making him do it, it is the creating the public mandate which has to impact the legislative process.
Among other things, we have to be willing to change some of our views. For example, in this healthcare business, some people don't want to give up on certain things that they've gotten because they're in a privileged group. Sometimes, in order to deal with the mass, you have to give up some of the privilege that you have.
Yeah, that's right. You know, giving up is, we try to call it sacrificing.
Sacrifice, that's right.
Sacrificing for the good of the whole. Now, I'm an African American. My background in Africa, they have this adage, I am because we are. And what I noticed in the country when I was in several of the African countries, that if somebody had a need and you had the resource, it was your obligation to share. I think maybe we might be able to say, let's sacrifice in the light of, well, because of enlightened self-interest. If we want a better educational system or better healthcare system or better transportation, if we want to compete in the world, it can't be that I'm at the top myself, my children. You got to lift everybody so that you compete. The Chinese have their approach, and they will be major partners or competitors with us in the decades ahead. If I look at their educational system, how they're preparing their engineers, their scientists, and their people who provide psychological and emotional and medical stuff, I have to look at how well am I preparing the kids in my community. Because if enough of them fall behind, the result will be the reduction of our standing among the nations of the world. It is enlightened self-interest that calls for sacrificing for the good of the whole, or clearly not hoarding all my money for myself while my culture slowly drifts into second-class citizenship.
You know, we're having a very good dialogue today. And in your new book, Whose Gospel, you talk about the importance of dialogue, about interaction. One of the things that happens, though, in dialogue, sometimes you get to a point where two sides just totally disagree, either factually or philosophically. How do you bring that together?
When you disagree that way, one of the things I like to do, for example, on many of the controversial issues today about sex, about war, about environment, there are some theological issues beneath the ground. Sometimes, if we can't agree on the particular policy, we may still have conversation about the root causes that inform those policies. For an example, if I talk with a fundamentalist, and a fundamentalist believes the Bible was shaped and formed this way, and I believe this way, maybe we don't have to talk about, hey, fundamentalist, what's your attitude about immigration, or what's your attitude about sex? We could talk about, let's look at how we understand the Bible together.
Today on African American Legends, we've been talking with the legendary Reverend James Ford, whose new book, Whose Gospel, has stimulated a lot of good conversation and discussion. Let's keep on talking. Thanks again to Jim Forbes for being with us today on African American Legends.
Good to be with you.